Picture this. Winfield Park Circuit, Australia. September 1990. The air is heavy with the smell of hot rubber, race fuel, and 35 years of touring car history. 40,000 fans pack the fences, shoulder to shoulder, waiting. The grid is lined with machines that have been fighting each other for years. Fords, Holdens, BMWs, screaming monsters built by men who understood exactly what it took to win here. Then something rolls quietly to the back of the grid. It is midnight blue, almost understated. It doesn't look angry. It doesn't look dangerous. It just looks different, sharper somehow, like a blade sitting next to kitchen knives. The lights go red. The grid erupts. 20 cars launch into the first corner in a wall of noise and aggression. And within 4 seconds, that midnight blue car is already gone. Not leading by half a length. Not easing to the front. Gone. Separated. Racing in a private category of its own while the other 19 cars compete amongst themselves for the privilege of second place. By lap 5, it is 11 seconds clear. By lap 10, the commentators have stopped trying to explain it and started reaching for metaphors. One of them, searching for words, lands on a creature from Japanese mythology, a force of destruction that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be stopped, and leaves nothing but silence in its wake. He calls it Godzilla. The name spreads through the paddock in hours. It reaches the press box by race end. By the following morning, it is on every motorsport front page in the Southern Hemisphere. Godzilla. But here is what nobody told you about that moment. That midnight blue car crossing the line in first place wasn't the triumph. The triumph had happened years earlier, in a room full of exhausted engineers who had just done something the automotive world thought was impossible. And the tragedy, the real tragedy, hadn't started yet. It was still coming, slowly. Quietly, dressed in the language of rule changes and technical regulations and administrative decisions. This is the story of a machine so perfect, so frighteningly complete, that the only weapon the world could find against it was a pen and a rulebook. This is the story of how Nissan built the most dominant touring car in history, and how that dominance destroyed it. Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything you think you know about this car. To understand why the R32 GT-R existed, you have to understand what Nissan had lost, and the date you need to know is 1972. That was the year Nissan pulled its factory motorsport program without warning. No press conference, no final race. The decision was made in boardrooms under the weight of the oil crisis and the growing pressure on car manufacturers to project responsibility rather than performance. Racing looked like vanity at the wrong moment, and so Nissan simply stopped. 16 years passed, 16 years in which rivals were not standing still. Toyota was racing, Mitsubishi was racing, BMW was building the M3, Porsche was building the 959. The world of performance cars was advancing at a pace Nissan had no answer for, because Nissan had walked away from the conversation entirely. Inside the company, a generation of engineers grew up in that silence. They built reliable cars, sensible cars, cars that started every morning and lasted 200,000 miles. But they knew, all of them knew, that something fundamental was missing. Nissan was competent. It was not great. And in the automotive world, the distance between competent and great is measured not in engineering, but in courage. Then came Kazutoshi Mizuno. Mizuno was not a senior engineer. He was not a board member. He was a young man with an obsession and enough stubbornness to make everyone around him uncomfortable. He had spent years studying what separated great performance cars from ordinary ones. Not just speed, but feel, response, the way a car communicates through the steering wheel and the seat and the accelerator pedal, the sense that the machine is alive beneath you. He had driven the Porsche 911 Turbo, the BMW M3, the Ferrari 308, and he had arrived at a conclusion that he repeated in every internal meeting he could get himself into. Nissan had nothing, absolutely nothing that belonged in the same conversation. The project he proposed wasn't a refresh of an existing model. It wasn't a limited edition with a body kit. It was a clean, chic car, designed from scratch with a single goal: to be the greatest driver's car in the world, from any manufacturer, at any price point. It took him 2 years of internal campaigning, budget battles, and near cancellations to get it approved. When the green light finally came in 1986, the team that gathered around the project carried the full weight of 16 years of silence on their shoulders. They named the project the Skyline GT-R, a name with history. The GT-R badge had last appeared in 1973, killed by the same oil crisis that had ended Nissan's racing program. Reviving it meant taking responsibility for a legacy, and the only way to honor that legacy was to build something extraordinary. Now, Before we go any further, stop, because this is the moment where I need you to understand something critical. Something that separates the R32 GT-R from every other performance car of its era. Nissan was not building a fast road car. They were building a racing car that happened to be road legal. Every single major system on the R32 GT-R was developed from scratch, specifically for this project, with one purpose: to make it unbeatable in competition. The road car wasn't the goal. It was the vehicle, the legal mechanism through which the real weapon could exist. The engine they built was called the RB26DET, 6 inline cylinders, twin turbochargers, 2.6 liters of displacement. And here is where the first dark secret enters this story. On paper, Nissan declared the RB26DET produced 276 horsepower. That was a lie. A formal, industry-agreed, politely maintained lie. In 1989, Japan's major car manufacturers had quietly signed what became known as the Gentleman's Agreement, a self-imposed limit of 276 horsepower on all domestic performance cars, supposedly to prevent dangerous speeds on public roads. Every manufacturer signed it. Every manufacturer exceeded it. But Nissan, with the RB26DET, exceeded it by the greatest margin of all. Independent tests placed the real output between 320 and 330 horsepower in standard production form. With basic modifications, it crossed 400 without strain. Racing versions would eventually produce 600, 700, 800 horsepower, numbers that at the time belonged exclusively on Formula One cars. But power was only half the equation. And here is where the engineering story becomes something closer to science fiction. Nissan called the system ATTESA, Advanced Total Traction Engineering System for All-Terrain. It was an all-wheel drive system unlike anything that had ever appeared on a production road car. Not a conventional AWD with a fixed torque split, not a mechanical center differential. A computer-controlled brain that read wheel slip, throttle input, steering angle, and lateral g-force in real time, and redistributed torque between the front and rear axles in milliseconds, invisibly, without the driver feeling any transition at all. Under normal driving, the R32 ran purely as a rear-wheel drive car, preserving the handling purity that makes performance cars alive. The instant the rear began to lose traction, ATTESA transferred up to 50% of torque forward. Not gradually, instantly. It was the electronic equivalent of having the fastest reflexes in motorsport built directly into the car's chassis. On top of that, Nissan added HICUS, four-wheel steering, with rear wheels rotating in coordination with the fronts at high speed to tighten cornering behavior and reduce the response gap between driver input and vehicle reaction. What this combination created was a car that didn't simply grip the road. It anchored itself to the road, on a racing circuit, in the wet, on cold tires, in conditions that made every other car on the grid unpredictable and nervous. The R32 GT-R was calm, controlled, absolutely, almost unnervingly in control. To homologate this machine for Group A, touring car racing, Nissan was required to build a minimum of 500 road legal examples. They built more than 44,000 because the road car wasn't a compliance exercise. It was the real thing. The racing program opened in 1989, targeting two championships: the Japanese Touring Car Championship on home soil and the Australian Touring Car Championship, the most respected, most competitive, most brutally demanding touring car series in the Southern Hemisphere. The Japanese results were immediate and total. In 1989, the GT-R entered 4 races. It won 4 races. In 1990, it entered every round of the JTCC. It won every single round. 29 starts in Japan and Australia combined. 29 wins, not one failure. Not one retirement from mechanical trouble. Not one race lost to a rival. A record so perfect it has never been approached in the history of Group A racing. The rivals tried everything. They pushed their cars beyond safe limits. They filed technical protests, arguing the ATTESA system violated the spirit of the regulations. They demanded scrutineering investigations. Every investigation found the same result. The R32 GT-R was legal, perfectly, infuriatingly, completely legal. And this is exactly the point in the story where most people think it ends, with triumph, with glory, with vindication. But you are still here, and you stayed for a reason, because the real story, the part that breaks you, is just beginning. After the 1990 season, the officials who ran the Australian Touring Car Championship sat down in a very uncomfortable room and had a conversation that had no good answer. What had happened that season wasn't racing. It was a demonstration. A single manufacturer had entered a competition designed to celebrate the best cars in the world and had made the rest of them look like they belonged in a different sport entirely. And so they did what regulators do when they are confronted with something they cannot defeat on merit. They changed the rules, carefully, methodically, using the language of balance of performance and technical compliance and sporting fairness. Weight penalties were adjusted, fuel restrictions were modified, technical specifications were rewritten in ways that, on paper, applied to all competitors equally. In practice, every single change targeted one specific car, one specific manufacturer, one specific set of advantages. They didn't ban the GT-R directly. That would have been too honest, too damaging, too clear an admission that the competition couldn't keep pace. Instead, they built a cage around it out of regulations, tightening it season by season until the car that had won 29 consecutive races was effectively a different car. Slower, heavier, restricted. Still wearing the same badge, but no longer carrying the same weapon underneath. By 1992, the regulations had been restructured so completely that competing under them was no longer a statement of dominance. It was an exercise in limitation. Nissan fought on, field-modified versions continuing to race, but the perfection of 1990 was gone. Not because rivals had grown stronger, because the rules had been written specifically to ensure it couldn't happen again. New Zealand adopted similar restrictions. Germany made the road car nearly impossible to insure. Britain had never allowed it to compete at the top level in the first place. One by one, the doors closed. But none of that, not the weight penalties, not the fuel restrictions, not the rule rewrites, was the true tragedy of the story. The true tragedy was quieter than that, closer to home. And if you've made it this far, you deserve to know what it was. By 1993, Japan's economy was collapsing, the bubble of the late 1980s. The era of limitless corporate ambition that had funded the GT-R project, that had filled the boardroom with people willing to spend whatever it took to build the best performance car in the world. That era was over. The money was gone. And with the money went the program. Not with a final race, not with a farewell season, not with any formal acknowledgement of what had been achieved. The factory racing program wound down in the same way it had wound down in 1972, quietly, without ceremony, without a press release. One day, it existed. Then, it didn't. There is an account that circulates among the engineers who worked on the GT-R program. On the last official day of the racing team's operation, some of those engineers wept. Whether the details are precise or not, the emotion it captures is real. These were men who had given years, in some cases, the best years of their careers, to a machine that had accomplished everything that had ever been asked of it. It had won every race it entered. It had silenced every critic. It had proven, definitively, that Japanese engineering could produce the greatest touring car in the history of the sport. And the world's response had been to ban it. Think about that for a moment. Not beaten, not outdesigned, not outdriven. Banned. Because being the best, when being the best is too absolute, too complete, too undeniable, becomes, in motorsport, a kind of crime. The road car continued in production. The R32 followed in 1995, slightly refined, slightly larger, criticized by purists for gaining weight, but praised by road testers for being more accessible. The R34 arrived in 1999 and became, for many, the definitive version. Shorter wheelbase, sharper instincts, the RB26 tuned further than it had ever been, a digital instrument cluster that gave the interior the atmosphere of a fighter cockpit. The United States refused to approve the R34 for sale, citing safety compliance issues, which only amplified its mythology, turning it into forbidden fruit, the car you had to import and hide, the car that Hollywood eventually placed in the hands of its most beloved street racer and called immortal. When Paul Walker drove an R34 GT-R in The Fast and the Furious, it wasn't product placement. It was the pop culture world recognizing what the motorsport world already knew. This car was different. This car was something else entirely. The R32 ended production in 2002. For 5 years, the GT-R name disappeared entirely. Nissan was restructured. Priorities changed. The badge that had been so carefully, so painfully revived in 1989 went dormant again for the second time in its history. It came back in 2007 as the R35. A completely different architecture, a twin-turbo V6. Electronics sophisticated enough that independent tests made it one of the fastest road cars ever recorded around the Nürburgring. A new legend, a new Godzilla. But not the same Godzilla. The R35 was built to impress. The R32 was built to prove. And there is a difference between those two things that matters more than any lap time. The R32 GT-R carried 16 years of silence into every race it entered. It carried the grief of engineers who had spent their careers at a company that had stopped believing in greatness. It carried the weight of a badge left dormant for 15 years, of a reputation that existed only in the memories of people who had watched the original GT-R destroy Japanese touring cars in the early 1970s before the world pulled the plug. Every corner it took in 1990 was a response. Every race it won was an answer to a question that had been sitting unanswered since 1972. And the answer was undeniable. But the world decided, quietly and bureaucratically, that undeniable was too much. Racing, at its best, exists to find the fastest car, driven by the most skilled people, in the most demanding conditions. The R32 GT-R was the fastest car. It was driven by skilled people. It performed in demanding conditions. It answered every question the sport asked of it with the same answer, every single time. And so the sport stopped asking. 29 races, 29 wins. A perfect record that has never been equaled in Group A history. And at the end of it, not a championship to be defended, not a future to be planned, but a rulebook redesigned specifically to ensure it never happened again. The midnight blue car crossing the line at Winfield Park in September 1990, crossing it first, for the 29th time, as the crowd stood in something closer to stunned silence than celebration. That was the most complete victory in the history of touring car racing. It was also, though no one knew it yet, the beginning of the end. Some machines raced to win. The R32 Nissan GT-R was built to prove that Japan could build the best car in the world. It proved it. Completely. Perfectly. Beyond any argument. And that was, in the end, the only thing they could never forgive it for. If this story of the car that was too good for its own world moved you, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which legend you want us to uncover next.